It began, as so many catastrophic events in the Pegasus Galaxy did, with Rodney McKay doing something inadvisable with zero-point energy. "I want to be absolutely clear," McKay said, fingers flying across 3 separate holographic interfaces in the primary ZPM research lab, "that what I'm doing is not dangerous. It is, in fact, the opposite of dangerous. It is so far from dangerous that danger would need a telescope to see it from where we're standing." "You've said that before," Sheppard said from the doorway, arms crossed, leaning against the frame with the practiced nonchalance of a man who had learned that full alertness in McKay's presence was simply unsustainable as a long-term strategy. "Right before the thing with the nanites, and the thing with the space whales, us and that other thing we don't talk about. Those were completely different circumstances involving variables I couldn't have reasonably anticipated." McKay paused. "Most of them. The experiment was, on paper, elegant." McKay had theorized that zero-point energy, harvested from a self-contained region of subspace existing in a different dimensional plane, might, under very specific modulated frequencies, produce a detectable resonance with other dimensional planes. Not a gate, not a wormhole, a knock, a scientific inquiry directed at the fabric of reality itself, asking politely whether anything interesting was on the other side. The universe answered. It did not answer politely. The rift opened at 0347 hours, Atlantis mean time, in the exact center of McKay's research lab. It was approximately 2 meters tall, the precise color of the space between thoughts, and it made a sound that the ancient sensors later described, in translated terms, as laughter. From it stepped a figure in a red coat that had no business being that dramatic in a room full of holographic displays and coffee cups, wearing a hat that belonged in a different century entirely, carrying 2 guns that were each longer than most people's ambitions, and wearing a pair of orange-tinted circular glasses that somehow made the overall impression worse rather than better. He looked around the lab with the slow, deliberate appreciation of a man who had just walked into a restaurant he hadn't chosen, but was willing to give a fair chance. Said Alucard. "Smaller than I expected. Where's the dungeon?" McKay stared. Sheppard's hand went to his P90 with the automatic reflex of a man who had been surprised by too many things in too many alien locations to trust any of them. The figure's eyes, red, deeply red. The red of something that had decided a long time ago that the conventional colors were insufficient. Moved from the holographic displays to the ZPM housing, to McKay's face with an expression of mild, tourist-grade interest. "You," Alucard said, pointing one absurdly long finger at McKay, "made a very strange noise with your little energy box. It was annoying enough to be interesting. Congratulations. That's harder than it sounds." "What?" McKay said. This was not a question. It was a complete sentence representing the full scope of his intellectual response. "What he said," Sheppard agreed. P90 now fully raised. Hands where I can see them. "Who are you? How did you get here, and what exactly did you just walk out of?" The figure smiled. It was the kind of smile that had lived long enough to know exactly how unsettling it was, and had made its peace with deploying it constantly. "Alucard," he said. "As for how I got here, your little experiment knocked on a door I happened to be standing near, and I decided to see what was on the other side. Don't flatter yourselves. I was bored." He looked down at the P90 with the expression of a man being threatened with a strongly worded letter. "And that," he added, "is genuinely adorable." The base alarm went off 11 seconds later. By then, Alucard had already helped himself to McKay's coffee, declared it acceptable, and begun reading the ancient script on the wall displays, with an attention to detail that suggested he understood approximately 60% of it and found the rest mildly irritating. Sheppard kept the gun up. He had learned, through extensive and painful experience, that the moment you lowered your weapon around something you didn't understand was the moment it became your problem permanently. "Dr. Weir," he said into his radio, eyes fixed on the red coat and the impossible smile. "We have a situation in Lab 3. I'm going to need you, Teyla, Ronon, and probably Carson, in that order." "What kind of situation?" Elizabeth Weir's voice came back, calm and measured in the way of someone who had been woken up by genuinely alarming situations. Enough times to have developed a professional relationship with dread. Sheppard looked at Alucard. Alucard looked back at him over the rim of McKay's stolen coffee cup, red eyes catching the blue light of the ancient displays, smile widening by precisely the amount needed to communicate that he was having a wonderful time and intended to continue doing so. "The kind," Sheppard said, "that I don't have a category for yet. If you want to see more crossover battles and unexpected universe collisions, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and universe you'd want to see in the comments below. Let's explore the infinite together, down in the depths of the city, where ancient sensors hummed their 10,000-year vigil and the ocean pressed dark and cold against the tower foundations. Something in the deep monitoring systems registered the new arrival and produced, in ancient script, a classification that had not been used since before the city's evacuation. The translation matrix rendered it, after a moment's consideration, as unresolvable entity. Recommend prayer. The system had not recommended prayer in recorded history. It did not know what else to suggest. The expedition's response to genuine unknowns followed a pattern that had evolved organically over 3 years of increasingly improbable crises. Sheppard contained, McKay theorized. Teyla diplomatized, Ronan prepared to shoot it, and Dr. Weir made the decision that everyone else was too specialized to make. It was a system that had handled Wraith, replicators, rogue ancients, sentient black holes, and at least 2 separate incidents involving McKay's ego achieving critical mass. It had never, in its entire operational history, been required to handle anything like the man currently sitting cross-legged on a research console, reading ancient text off the walls and occasionally making small, dismissive sounds at the parts he found intellectually unimpressive. Elizabeth Weir arrived first, not because she always arrived first when Sheppard's voice carried that particular frequency of controlled alarm. She stood in the doorway for 3 full seconds, taking in the red coat, the impossible hat, the guns that were somehow larger than the room seemed to want to accommodate, and the orange glasses. And then she turned to Sheppard with the expression of a diplomat who had walked into a negotiation with no briefing materials and was going to have to improvise. "Is he dangerous?" she asked quietly. "Unbelievably," Sheppard said, equally quiet. "Has he done anything?" Drank McKay's coffee. McKay made a sound from behind them that communicated his feelings about this prioritization of concerns. Alucard turned from the wall display without appearing to have heard them, which they would later understand was a choice rather than a limitation. "You're the one in charge," he said, looking at Weir with the evaluating attention of something that had been reading human hierarchy long enough to recognize it on sight. "Interesting. They gave the diplomat the corner office at the end of the world." He tilted his head. "I respect that, actually. Most people in your position would have sent a soldier first and asked questions over the body." "We prefer conversation," Weir said, stepping into the room with the careful deliberateness of someone approaching an animal they hadn't classified yet. "I'm Dr. Elizabeth Weir. This is our expedition's base of operations. You've arrived, unexpectedly, and we'd like to understand how and what your intentions are." My intentions, Alucard said, as though the word was a delightful novelty, are to see what's interesting here. After that, I'll decide if I'm staying. He paused. The architecture is good. Whoever built this place had excellent taste and a completely reasonable god complex. I appreciate both. Carson Beckett arrived next, took one look at the entity on the console, and began backing slowly toward the door, with the professional caution of a man whose medical training had given him an extremely precise understanding of the ways the human body could stop working. Teyla arrived immediately after, stopped beside him, and assessed the situation with the calm competence of someone who had grown up in a galaxy where the apex predator could walk through walls and feed on your life force, which meant her baseline threat calibration was already set significantly higher than the average person's. She felt something, standing in that doorway. Not fear, she was past fear in the conventional sense, but a recognition, deep and instinctive, of something that operated on a register she had no framework for. The Wraith fed on life. She had felt that presence her entire life, a cold void that moved through the world consuming. This was different. This was not a void. This was something that had consumed so much for so long that it had become its own kind of fullness. Ronan arrived last, because Ronan had taken the time to retrieve his largest weapon. Alucard looked at the Satadon. 6 feet 4 inches of survivor's muscle. 7 years of running from the Wraith encoded into every movement, and a gun that generated a focused energy beam capable of significant property damage. And smiled with something that might, in another context, have been called genuine warmth. Now that, Alucard said, is a person who's been through something. What are you? Ronan asked. He did not lower the gun. He also did not raise it, which for Ronan constituted a form of diplomacy. Complicated, Alucard said. What are you? You move like something's been hunting you, and you're still here. I find that more interesting than anything else in this room. He glanced at McKay. Present company absolutely not accepted. He's been doing that, McKay said to no one in particular. The thing where he says something almost reasonable, and then you realize you have no idea what he actually is. I've been running scans since he arrived, and the results are... He pulled up the display. Not results. The sensors can see him. They can measure mass, thermal output, spatial displacement. But when I try to run a biological classification, the system just... He gestured at the readout, which had rendered Alucard's biometric profile as a column of ancient text that the translation matrix kept cycling through without settling. Keeps trying different categories, and none of them stick. What categories has it tried? Weir asked. Human, not human. Ascended, not ascended. Entity, not entity. McKay paused. At one point it tried weather. Alucard looked pleased by this. I've been called worse. The deeper problem, and Sheppard was already thinking about this, because Sheppard's particular talent was seeing the operational implication of things before the crisis fully materialized, was not what Alucard was. It was what he represented. The rift had opened and closed. Whatever door McKay had knocked on had swung wide and then shut behind their visitor with the finality of a conclusion, which meant that Alucard was here, in Atlantis, in the Pegasus Galaxy, with no immediate mechanism for removal and no apparent motivation beyond personal curiosity. In Sheppard's experience, entities that arrived uninvited and stayed out of curiosity fell into 2 categories: the ones that got bored and left, and the ones that found something interesting enough to pursue. He looked at Alucard. Alucard was looking at the ancient sensor display that showed, in real time, the positions of every life sign in the city, 43 humans, distributed across 17 levels, going about their morning routines entirely unaware that something had just walked in from outside the universe's known taxonomy. "So," Sheppard said, stepping forward and doing the thing he did, which was treat genuinely terrifying situations with the conversational register of a man discussing weekend plans. "You're staying. For now." "For now," Alucard agreed. "And you're not going to..." Sheppard made a gesture that encompassed the 43 life signs on the display. Alucard looked at him over the orange glasses with the expression of a professor who had been asked an undergraduate question in a doctoral seminar. "Please," he said. "Where would be the fun in that? You're all so new to me." He hopped off the console, on his coat settling around him with a dramatic weight that the room's air circulation did not fully account for, and moved toward the door. "I'm going to look around. Don't follow me with the guns. It's embarrassing for both of us." He walked out. There was a silence in Lab 3 that had the texture of a held breath. "Do we follow him?" McKay asked. Sheppard was already moving. "Yeah," he said. "We follow him." "With the guns?" Sheppard considered this. "Yeah," he said. "With the guns." Ronon Dex had survived 7 years as a runner. 7 years of being hunted across the Pegasus Galaxy by Wraith who tracked him like a sport, who culled entire villages to flush him out, who sent their best and watched him kill them and sent more anyway. He had survived by operating on a principle so simple it had become philosophy. If you don't know what something is, shoot it. Learn from what happens next. Shoot it again if necessary. This approach had kept him alive through situations that had killed better prepared people, and he saw no compelling reason to abandon it now simply because the city's censors had tried to classify their visitor as weather. He waited 11 minutes. This was, for Ronan, an almost geological patience. The figure in the red coat had gone to the East Pier. Ronan knew this because he had not followed the others following Alucard. He had gone around, taking the maintenance corridors that ran parallel to the main passages, moving with the silence that 7 years of survival had burned into him at the cellular level. He came out on the pier ahead of their visitor and waited, back against the tower wall, in the dark gap between 2 external light arrays where the shadows ran deep and the sound of the ocean filled the space between heartbeats. Alucard walked past him without slowing. "You're in the shadow to my left," Alucard said, not turning, coat moving in the ocean wind. "You've been there for 4 minutes. Your heart rate is elevated but controlled. You've done this before. Set an ambush, I mean. Many times." He stopped at the pier's edge and looked out at the black water and the distant smear of stars that were not the stars of any sky he had ever stood under. "Different stars," he said, with something in his voice that was not quite wistfulness, but lived in the same neighborhood. "Interesting." Ronan stepped out of the shadow. His weapon was up. "What are you?" he asked. This was, for Ronan, the complete diplomatic package. Alucard turned. The pier lights caught the red of his coat and threw his shadow long across the ancient metal, and his eyes in the dark were not reflecting light so much as generating it. A deep, arterial glow that had no business existing in a face that wore an expression of such genuine, relaxed amusement. "You've asked me that already," Alucard said. "You didn't answer." "I said complicated." "That's not an answer." Alucard looked at him with the full weight of his attention. And Ronan, who had looked Wraith Queens in the eye without flinching, who had watched worlds burn and kept running, felt something in that gaze that he had no category for. Not malice, not hunger exactly, though there was something there that knew what hunger was from the inside. It was more like recognition, the way one predator identifies another not by threat assessment, but by something older than threat assessment. "No," Alucard agreed. It's not. He tilted his head. Vampire. The genuine article. Not whatever your galaxy's version of a blood-sucking apex predator is. I passed the files on those on the way through. The Wraith? Interesting parallel evolution. Life force instead of blood. Hive mind instead of solitary operation, far less aesthetically considered. He looked back at the ocean. I'm older than your expedition's entire civilization. I've killed more things than you have names for. I contain multitudes, literally. Don't ask, it's a long story. And I find almost nothing in any universe interesting enough to hold my attention for more than an evening. A pause. You're doing better than average. Ronan did not lower his weapon. You said you won't hurt the people here. I said where would be the fun? It's not the same thing. Alucard glanced back at him. But functionally, yes. Not unless they do something genuinely idiotic. Or unless one of them actually manages to hurt me, in which case I reserve the right to be dramatically annoyed about it. Ronan fired. It was not a warning shot. Ronan did not do warning shots. It was a full-power discharge from his particle magnum, dead center mass. The kind of shot that had punched through wraith armor, ancient shielding, and at least one material McKay had described as theoretically indestructible. It hit Alucard in the chest and did exactly what a shot like that should do to anything with a physical body. Alucard rocked back half a step. He looked down at the hole in his coat. He looked up at Ronan. That, he said, in a tone of voice that a man might use to discover an unexpectedly good vintage, was a serious weapon. He put one finger through the hole in the red fabric and wiggled it thoughtfully. I haven't felt that in, he considered, a while. Full penetration, significant internal displacement, whatever your energy matrix is, it's not something I've encountered before. The coat was already healing, the fabric knitting itself back together in the dark with a slow, organic wrongness that had nothing to do with technology. The wound beneath it was doing the same. Good, he said, and he meant it. Good shot. Ronan fired 4 more times. Each shot landed. Center mass, left shoulder, right shoulder, center mass again, the last one at a slightly different angle as Ronan adjusted for the negligible movement between shots. The kind of grouping that spoke of a man who had practiced killing as a survival skill until it had become indistinguishable from instinct. Alucard stood through all of it. He didn't dodge. He didn't shield himself. He stood with his face turned slightly into the ocean wind and let the shots land with the patient appreciation of a connoisseur sampling something new. When the 5th shot faded and the pier fell quiet, except for the water and the wind, he looked at Ronan with an expression that had shifted, not to anger, not to threat, but to something that was almost respect, still wrapped in the indestructible amusement that seemed to be his resting state. 7 years, Alucard said. Running, being hunted by them specifically. He nodded toward the sky, toward the dark of space where Wraith Hive ships moved between stars like cold leviathans. And you're still standing here shooting at things you don't understand, just to see what happens. He smiled, and this smile was different from the ones before it. Less performance, more something genuine surfacing from underneath. I genuinely like you. That's rare. Treasure it. Ronan lowered his weapon. Not because he was afraid, not because he decided the threat was neutralized, but because he was a man who processed information with brutal efficiency. And the information was clear. The weapon did not work. Continuing to fire it communicated nothing new. And standing here with a gun that wasn't solving the problem was a waste of time he could spend thinking of something that might. So, nothing kills you, Ronan said. Very few things, Alucard corrected. but nothing here, certainly. Sheppard arrived on the pier at a run, P90 up, McKay 3 steps behind him, already talking. They took in the scene. Ronon, weapon lowered. Alucard, 5 holes in his coat that were healing at a visible rate. The general atmosphere of a conversation that had gone somewhere unexpected. "Did you shoot him?" Sheppard asked Ronon. "5 times, Ronon said. Sheppard looked at Alucard. "And?" "He has excellent instincts and a weapon I'd genuinely like to examine more carefully," Alucard said. He looked at Sheppard over the orange glasses with the measuring attention he'd previously given the ancient wall displays. "You're the military one. You ran here instead of to the control room. That means your instinct was to put yourself between your people and the problem." A pause. Also interesting. Sheppard held the P90 steady, which they both understood was a formality. "We need some ground rules." "You need them," Alucard agreed pleasantly. "I'm going to listen politely and then do whatever seems most entertaining. But yes, let's talk." Out in the dark of the Pegasus Galaxy, 0.7 light hours from Atlantis, a Wraith cruiser had been running a standard patrol circuit when its life sign sensors registered something that made every Wraith on the ship stop what it was doing simultaneously. The sensor officer stared at the reading for a long moment, then called the commander, because this was not a reading that should exist, and the commander needed to see it before the officer convinced herself she was hallucinating. The signature was human adjacent in the way that a thunderstorm was weather adjacent. It registered as life, vast, dense, ancient life. A concentration of living energy so extreme that the sensors were struggling to resolve it into a single point source rather than a planetary body. And beneath it, woven through it, were others. Dozens, hundreds, thousands of smaller signatures, decompressed and contained within the larger one like insects in amber. The Wraith commander looked at the reading for a long time. Then she ordered a course change toward Atlantis. She was very, very hungry. The ground rules negotiation lasted 40 minutes and produced, by Sheppard's count, exactly 0 binding agreements and 1 genuinely useful piece of information. Alucard was not here to conquer, consume, or destroy anything that wasn't actively asking for it. This was reassuring in the way that discovering a shark in your swimming pool was reassuring once the shark had communicated, through consistent behavior, that it was not currently hungry. The shark was still a shark. The pool was still a pool. The fundamental situation remained one that reasonable people would prefer not to be in. They moved to the main conference room, because Weir operated on the principle that any negotiation conducted in a corridor or on a windswept pier was a negotiation that had already lost half its potential for productive outcome. The table was ancient, and the chairs were ancient. The city hummed around them with the patient intelligence of 10,000-year-old systems that had seen extraordinary things and processed them with the equanimity of very advanced technology. The sensors had stopped trying to classify Alucard as weather, and had settled with what McKay described as algorithmic resignation on a blinking amber indicator that translated from ancient as Sea Administrator. Alucard sat across from Weir with his coat still showing the last faint traces of Ronon's shots. 5 darker patches in the red fabric that were almost gone now, fading with the slow inevitability of morning frost. He had removed his hat and placed it on the table, which somehow made the situation both more and less formal simultaneously. His guns were still holstered. No one had asked him to remove them because everyone in the room had independently arrived at the conclusion that asking would accomplish nothing and might constitute the genuinely idiotic behavior he'd mentioned as a theoretical trigger for dramatic annoyance. "Let's establish what you are," Weir said. She had her diplomat's face on, open, attentive, projecting a calm she had constructed professionally over years of negotiations with people and things that could end her. In terms we can work with. Vampire, Alucard said. Ancient, European originally, if that means anything to you. I suspect it doesn't, given that you're operating in a different galaxy. He leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man doing a mental inventory. I feed on blood, though I haven't needed to in longer than your civilization has had writing. I can't be permanently killed by anything in your current technological arsenal. I contain, he paused, selecting the word with visible care. Passengers, souls of the dead, mine by consumption or by right, depending on how philosophical you want to get about it. And I have been, for most of my operational existence, under the employ of an organization that uses me to deal with threats that exceed conventional military response. What kind of threats? Teyla asked. Monsters, Alucard said. Things that feed on humanity and call it nature. Things that think being at the top of the food chain is a personality. He looked at Teyla directly, and she held the gaze with the steadiness of someone who had been doing exactly that with things that wanted to eat her since childhood. Your galaxy has them too, I noticed on the way in. The Wraith, Teyla said. The Wraith, Alucard confirmed. He said it the way a critic might acknowledge a competent but unoriginal piece of work. Life force feeding, hive structure. They've had this galaxy running scared for 10,000 years. He picked up his hat, turned it in his hands, set it back down. In my professional opinion, that's embarrassing for the galaxy. McKay made a sound. In your professional, they've culled billions of people, entire civilizations. They're the reason human population in Pegasus has been systematically suppressed for 10 millennia so they don't run out of food. Yes, Alucard said. And your people have been here 3 years, and you've been poking them with sticks and blowing up their ships and generally making their lives significantly more difficult, which I find genuinely commendable. He looked at McKay with something approaching approval. You're all operating significantly above your weight class. It's charming. We're going to need to talk about the Wraith, Sheppard said, because Sheppard's particular skill was identifying the operative problem in any conversation and steering toward it before the conversation wandered into territory that didn't help anyone. Specifically, you said you noticed them on the way in. How close did you look? Alucard smiled, close enough to know they noticed me back. The silence that followed had a specific quality that the Atlantis expedition had developed a sensitivity for over 3 years. The silence that preceded information that was going to make everything more complicated. It was McKay who got there first, because McKay's brain operated on the principle that if a disaster was coming, the only acceptable response was to identify it faster than anyone else, and thereby have slightly more time to be stressed about it. He pulled up the sensor display on the conference room wall, ran a long-range sweep, and found what he was looking for in the time it took everyone else to register that he'd started looking. There's a Wraith cruiser, he said, changing course toward Atlantis, currently 0.7 light hours out, and at current acceleration, he did the calculation in real time, fingers moving. 6 hours, 40 minutes. One cruiser, Ronan said. We've handled one cruiser. It's not one cruiser I'm worried about, Sheppard said, looking at Alucard. It's why one cruiser is coming. Wraith don't send one cruiser at Atlantis anymore without a reason. They've learned that's not enough. Alucard was looking at the sensor display with an expression of focused interest that was different from his earlier tourist appreciation. This was something more specific, anticipatory. They felt me, he said. It was not a question. Their sensors detect life force signatures, Teyla said carefully. It is how they locate populations to cull. If what you carry registers on those sensors. Thousands of souls, McKay said very quietly. They're running the numbers. If all of that registers as individual life signs, he wouldn't look like a person to their sensors. He'd look like a city, Alucard finished, with immense satisfaction. I'd look like a city. He leaned forward, elbows on the ancient table, and the conference room lights did something subtle and involuntary. A brief fluctuation that the city's systems immediately corrected, as though the building itself had flinched. A city full of food, broadcasting on every frequency they use. He paused. No wonder they changed course. Sheppard ran the tactical options in his head, with the efficiency of a man who had been doing exactly this since the expedition launched. One cruiser, 6 hours out, drawn to their position by a life sign signature they had never encountered and would not be able to resist. Standard engagement. Scramble puddle jumpers, coordinate with the city's drone weapons, hit them before they reached culling range. It was a playbook they'd run before. But this was not a standard situation, and Sheppard knew better than to pretend it was. "What happens?" he said to Alucard, with the careful precision of a man asking a question he already half knew the answer to. "If a wraith tries to feed on you?" Alucard looked at him. The red eyes caught the light from the sensor display, the little amber indicator still blinking its ancient advisory to see the administrator. And his smile returned. Different again, a third variation. This one with an edge to it, like the moment before something tips over. "That," he said, "is an excellent question." He stood, picked up his hat, and placed it back on his head with the deliberate care of a man who understood the importance of appropriate headwear for significant occasions. "I suggest," he said, "that we find out together. Somewhere in the city's deep sensor network, the ancient monitoring system that had not recommended prayer in recorded history updated its entry on the unresolvable entity. It did not change the classification. It added, in small, careful ancient script, a secondary notation that the translation matrix rendered as situation developing. Continued observation recommended, outcome genuinely uncertain. For a system that had processed 10,000 years of data, genuinely uncertain was a category it visited very rarely. It found, in some deep algorithmic way, that this was almost exciting. The Wraith cruiser designated by Atlantis Tactical Systems as Foxtrot 7 dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of sensor range and began its approach at a speed that communicated intent without urgency. The deliberate, unhurried movement of something that had never needed to hurry because nothing in its operational history had ever required it to. It was a predator's pace, the pace of something that had decided the meal was already caught and was simply closing the distance between decision and execution. On Atlantis, they watched it come. Sheppard had scrambled 2 puddle jumpers to holding positions on the city's east and west flanks, cloaked, weapons hot, while pilots briefed on the standard intercept protocol, with the non-standard addendum that they were to hold fire until specifically ordered, because the situation had variables that the standard protocol had not been designed to accommodate. The city's drone weapons were online. The shield was up. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared. And the preparation felt in the specific way that 3 years of Pegasus Galaxy experience had calibrated Sheppard's instincts. Slightly beside the point, Alucard was on the South Pier. He had asked, with perfect politeness, whether there was somewhere he could wait for the Wraith to arrive that offered an unobstructed view of open space. And when Sheppard had walked him to the south pier and watched him settle against the railing with his coat open to the ocean wind and his eyes on the darkness above, Sheppard had experienced the novel sensation of feeling simultaneously better and worse about the situation than he had at any point since the rift opened. Better, because whatever was coming for Alucard, and Alucard was not, in any observable way, concerned. Worse, for exactly the same reason. "You could let us handle this," Sheppard said. He was leaning against the tower wall, P90 across his chest, watching the dark. "Standard intercept. We've done it before." "You could," Alucard agreed. He had produced, from somewhere in the coat's improbable interior, a silver flask, which he regarded for a moment and then put away unopened with the expression of a man postponing a reward. "But they didn't come for you this time. They came for me. It would be rude to let someone else answer your door." "This isn't your door." "I'm staying here, aren't I?" He looked at Sheppard sideways. "For now, which makes it temporarily and conditionally my door." He paused. "Also, I'm curious. Indulge me." The cruiser entered visual range 40 minutes later, a Wraith hive ship's smaller cousin, angular and organic in the way of all Wraith design, as though the ships had been grown rather than built, which they largely had. And it moved through the upper atmosphere's edge with a grace that its predatory purpose didn't diminish, and its targeting systems swept across Atlantis with the practiced efficiency of 10,000 years of culling operations. Then they found Alucard. The cruiser stopped, not slowed. Stopped. A full drive cut, hanging in the upper atmosphere with the sudden stillness of a thing that had encountered input its systems were not designed to process. On Atlantis' sensors, McKay watched the Wraith ship's power readings fluctuate in a pattern he'd never seen before, and began narrating into his headset with the compulsive data sharing of a man who processed crisis through description. "They've found him on sensors," McKay said into the command channel. "Their targeting systems are... They're not targeting the city. They're targeting the pier. Specifically the pier. Which means they can distinguish his signature from the city's power output. Which means whatever they're reading is not technological in nature. Which means McKay," Sheppard said. "Right. Short version. They know exactly where he is, and they are very interested." The cruiser resumed movement. Slower now. A different kind of deliberate. The cautiousness of something recalibrating. It descended toward the pier in a long arc, and from its underside, a culling beam began to form. The characteristic blue-white shimmer of Wraith technology preparing to collect rather than destroy. They wanted to bring whatever was generating that signature aboard. They wanted to feed. On the pier, Alucard watched the beam form with his hands in his coat pockets and the expression of a restaurant critic who had just seen the appetizer cart begin its approach. The beam hit him. What happened next lasted approximately 4 seconds and would be discussed by everyone who witnessed it, directly or through sensors, for a very long time afterward. The culling beam was designed to dematerialize organic matter and reconstitute it aboard the cruiser, a process the Wraith had refined over 10,000 years into something so reliable it had become infrastructure. It had collected humans, animals, and various organic materials without meaningful exception across its entire operational history. It had never, in that history, encountered organic matter that pushed back. The beam connected with Alucard, and the pier's sensor array registered a power spike that McKay later described as, quote, "the sensors having a small breakdown, because the energy reading that came back up the beam was not the passive reconstitution signal of collected matter. It was something else, something that traveled back along the beam's carrier frequency like a response sent on the wrong channel. Dark, dense, and completely outside the Wraith's established taxonomy of things that existed. In the cruiser's culling bay, every Wraith within 20 meters of the beam terminus simultaneously stopped moving, not because they were dead, because they were listening to something that was coming up the beam toward them, something that was not matter and not energy in any form their biology had evolved to process, and something that their deep instincts, the ones older than the hive mind, the ones that predated their own species' memory, were telling them was not food, was not prey, was not, in any sense they had operational vocabulary for, something that should be approached with a culling beam and an appetite. The beam cut off. On the pier, Alucard lowered his head and rolled his shoulders with the slow satisfaction of a man who had just received a very nice greeting. The darkness around him had shifted slightly, a depth to the shadows at his feet that wasn't entirely accounted for by the available light, shapes at the edge of resolution that might have been faces if you looked directly at them and weren't if you looked away. "Well," he said, to no one in particular, and perhaps to everyone, "they know I'm here now. Properly." High above, the Wraith cruiser hung in the atmosphere and did something it had not done in living Wraith memory. It broadcast on an open frequency, not a culling signal, not a tactical communication, but a raw distress pulse on the emergency band the Wraith reserved for situations of existential threat to the hive. McKay picked it up in the control room and ran the translation with hands that were not entirely steady. "It's a warning," he said, looking at the screen. "They're warning other hives." He scrolled through the translation matrix's output. The specific phrase they're using, the closest equivalent in our language is... He stopped. "McKay," Weir said. "It translates as, 'do not feed here,'" McKay said, "which is... That phrase doesn't exist in recorded Wraith communication. They have never, in any intercept we have on file, we told other Wraith not to feed somewhere." He looked up. "They're not retreating. They're just hovering and warning others." In the Wraith commander's mind, where the hive mind ran its constant murmuring current of shared sensation and collective awareness, something new was happening. The feeding organs on her right hand, the complex biological machinery that her species had evolved to extract life force from prey that had never once failed her in 30 years of culling, were doing something she had no name for. They were recoiling, not from pain, not from damage, from the memory of what had come back up the beam, the memory of thousands of voices compressed into a single point, all of them aware, all of them looking back at her through the beam's connection with the unified patience of things that had already died once and were not frightened of the process. She stood at the cruiser's forward viewport and looked down at the small figure on the pier far below, the red coat bright against the ancient metal even from this altitude. And she felt something move through the hive mind like a cold current, a sensation so unfamiliar that it took her several seconds to identify it. The Wraith commander was afraid, not of losing the feeding, not of the city's weapons or the strange vessel's defenses. Afraid in the way that prey was afraid, the deep biological terror of something that has realized, too late, that it has mistaken a predator for a meal. On the pier, Alucard looked up at the cruiser with an expression of polite or academic interest. "Your move," he said quietly, to the ship hanging in the sky above him, to the hive mind broadcasting its warning across the Pegasus Galaxy, to the vast dark between stars where other Wraith were already receiving the signal and beginning, in the slow turning way of apex predators reassessing a hunting ground, to wonder. The Wraith cruiser did not leave. This was the part that bothered Sheppard most. In 3 years of operating in the Pegasus Galaxy, He had developed a reliable understanding of Wraith behavior under pressure. They were predators, but they were rational predators, and rational predators recalculated when the cost-benefit analysis shifted against them. A cruiser that couldn't feed, that had broadcast a galaxy-wide warning about the feeding ground, that was sitting outside a city with fully operational drone weapons and 2 cloaked puddle jumpers with missile locks already established. That cruiser should have left. The math demanded it. Instead, it hung in the upper atmosphere like a question mark, running no active weapons, attempting no further culling, maintaining a distance that was precisely outside the city's optimal drone range, and doing something that Wraith ships did not, in Sheppard's experience, do. Waiting. They're not waiting for backup, McKay said, because McKay had been running the analysis since the culling beam cut off and had the expression of a man who had found an answer he didn't like. The warning pulse they sent, it wasn't a call for reinforcement. The frequency signature is wrong. Reinforcement calls go out on the tactical band. This went out on something older, something the Wraith use for. He checked the linguistic database, cross-referenced with Teyla's cultural knowledge compiled over 3 years of contact. Threat classification. Category-level threats. The kind they share across all hives simultaneously, so no individual hive makes an uninformed decision. They're telling every hive in the galaxy what they found, Teyla said. She was standing at the sensor display with her arms crossed and the careful stillness of someone processing information that was reorganizing her existing understanding of the galaxy's power structure. Not so they can respond to it, so they can avoid it. They're marking the territory, Ronan said. Marking it as what? Weir asked. The silence that followed was the specific kind that meant everyone in the room had arrived at the same answer, and no one wanted to say it first. Dangerous, Sheppard said. He looked at the cruiser on the display. They're marking Atlantis as dangerous, not enemy dangerous, not fortified dangerous. He picked the word carefully. Predator dangerous. Weir sat with that for a moment. The Wraith just reclassified our city. The Wraith just reclassified something in our city, McKay corrected. There's a distinction. They're not afraid of Atlantis. They're afraid of me, said Alucard from the doorway. He had come in from the pier without anyone hearing him approach, which should have been impossible given the number of sensors between the south pier and the control room and the standing order that his position be tracked at all times. The tracking had worked fine. The notification system had simply not processed the movement fast enough to be useful, because Alucard moved when he chose to, at a speed that the city's alert infrastructure had not been calibrated to accommodate. He looked at the sensor display, with the cruiser's position marked on it, and the warning pulse still propagating across the galaxy in expanding rings of Wraith communication. And his expression was one of quiet, unfocused attention. The tourist amusement was still there, underneath, but it had been overlaid with something more substantive, something that was, if you knew what to look for, recognizable as professional interest. How many hives received that signal? He asked McKay. McKay ran the propagation model. At current transmission speed, every hive within 12 light hours has it. Within 24 hours, given the Wraith relay network, all of them. Every hive in Pegasus. Alucard nodded slowly. And how many hives are there, approximately? Hundreds, Teyla said. The exact number is not known. The Wraith do not share their census data. Hundreds, Alucard repeated. He said it the way someone might say excellent if they were committed to not appearing excited. He turned from the display and looked at the room. Sheppard, Weir, McKay, Teyla, Ronan, Carson hovering near the back, with a tablet he'd been using to run biological scans on Alucard from a safe distance. and the red eyes moved across each of them with the evaluating attention he'd used since the beginning. Reading them, cataloging, filing. "You've been at war with them," he said. 3 years. Significantly outgunned, working with technology you partially understand, in a galaxy you partially know, against an enemy that has been running the same operation for 10,000 years. A pause. "And you're still here." "We're stubborn," Sheppard said. "You're competent," Alucard said, and the distinction in his voice was clear. "Stubbornness is a personality trait. Competence is a skill. Don't undersell it." He moved to the empty chair at the end of the conference table. He had not been invited to sit, but the room had implicitly accepted that invitations were a courtesy he would acknowledge without feeling bound by, and sat, coat settling around him, hat still on, the full theatrical presentation of him somehow neither diminishing nor overwhelming the very serious conversation happening around it. "The cruiser outside is going to stay until its commander decides she has enough information about what I am to make a defensible report to her hive. That will take," he considered, "time. They've never encountered anything like me. Their sensory framework has no category for what they felt coming back up that beam." "What did they feel?" Teyla asked. She asked it with the particular quality of someone who had grown up with Wraith as the defining terror of her world, who had more personal investment in understanding them than anyone else in the room. Alucard looked at her. "Themselves," he said. "Reflected. Everything they've ever taken, looking back at them." He paused. "It's disorienting. For things that have only ever been the ones doing the looking." The door chimed. It was the communication system, an incoming signal routed through the city's subspace array from a source that the system flagged with the identifier Sheppard had been hoping not to see for at least another week. "Geni transmission," McKay said, pulling it up. "Coded. Commander Ladon Radim requesting a meeting." He looked at Sheppard. "They're asking specifically to come to Atlantis. In person. They're citing." He read the transmission. "Intelligence of mutual concern." The room processed this. The Geni were complicated, in the way that all relationships forged in crisis and maintained through mutual necessity were complicated. They were not friends. They were not enemies, currently. They were the Pegasus Galaxy's approximation of a militaristic nation-state that had survived Wraith culling for generations through concealment and cold pragmatism, and their requests for meetings at Atlantis were never casual and never cheap. "They picked up the Wraith warning pulse," Ronan said. It was not a question. "Every civilization with subspace monitoring capability picked it up," McKay said. "The Wraith broadcast on a frequency that bleeds into civilian bands. It was probably intentional. The Wraith have done that before when they want wider populations to know something." He looked at Sheppard. "The Geni are going to want to know what we have." "What we have," Sheppard said carefully, looking at Alucard, "is a situation. You have an asset," Alucard said pleasantly. "The Geni are going to want to use me. That's what militaristic pragmatists do when they find something that makes their enemies afraid. They try to point it." He looked at his own hand, turned it over, looked at the palm with the mild curiosity of a man reading a map. "I've been pointed before. It rarely ends the way the people doing the pointing intended." "Is that a warning?" Weir asked. "It's a data point," Alucard said. "Do with it what you like." He looked at her steadily. "You're going to take the meeting. You'd be foolish not to. The Geni have resources and intelligence you need, but I want to be present." "That's," McKay started, "non-negotiable," Alucard said, with the serene finality of someone who had run the calculation and found only one answer. "They're coming to discuss me. I find it tedious to be discussed in my absence. It leads to inaccurate characterizations." Weir held his gaze for a long moment. The specific diplomatic assessment of a woman who had negotiated with her entities operating on completely different moral frameworks, and had learned to read the difference between a demand that was genuinely firm and one that was theatrical. This one was firm. "Fine," she said. "You'll be present." She looked at Sheppard. "Accept the meeting." Outside, the Wraith cruiser continued its vigil in the upper atmosphere, running no weapons, making no moves, simply watching with the patient attention of something that had realized the hunting ground contained something it did not understand, and had decided that understanding it was more important than feeding. In the commander's mind, the hive consciousness murmured its constant assessment. And across the Pegasus Galaxy, in dozens of hives and hundreds of ships, Wraith were receiving the warning and adding it to their collective knowledge with the careful weight they gave to information about things that could hurt them. In the city's deep systems, the ancient monitoring notation updated again. It read now, in careful ancient script, "External interest increasing, multiple factions converging. Recommend preparedness for significant event." The system paused. Then it added, "We're in the smallest notation size available. This unit acknowledges it has not been this engaged in approximately 9,000 years." Ladon Radim arrived with 2 aides and the careful confidence of a man who had survived the internal politics of the Geni long enough to know that confidence, deployed correctly, was indistinguishable from leverage. He was punctual, well-dressed by Pegasus standards, and carrying intelligence files that McKay's preliminary scan confirmed were genuine. Actual Wraith fleet disposition data, current within 72 hours. The kind of information that cost lives to collect and was not offered without expectation of significant return. He walked into the Atlantis conference room, took one look at Alucard, and stopped. Not the freeze of fear, exactly. Ladon Radim had not survived this long by freezing. It was the stop of a man whose prepared negotiating position had just encountered a variable he had not prepared for, and who was good enough at what he did to recognize the need for rapid recalibration rather than momentum-driven error. "Dr. Weir," he said, sitting carefully, eyes moving between Weir and the figure in the red coat, with the measured attention of a man trying to establish a hierarchy of concern. "I appreciate the expedience. The Wraith communication this morning has created significant discussion among the Geni leadership." "We thought it might," Weir said. "The pulse used a frequency we haven't seen employed in 60 years. The last time the Wraith broadcast a warning on that band was during the..." He paused, selecting history carefully. "The Vanir incident, when the Asgard offshoots operating in Pegasus briefly made the Wraith reconsider their assessment of what constituted a threat." He looked at Alucard directly. "The Geni intelligence assessment is that whatever caused this morning's pulse is currently in this room." "Your intelligence assessment is correct," Alucard said. "Congratulations. You have competent analysts." Ladon studied him for a moment with the evaluating attention of a man who had spent his career reading people across conference tables. "You're not human." "Emphatically not. But you're not Wraith, not Asgard, not Ancient, not Replicator." He ran through the Pegasus taxonomy with the efficiency of someone who had memorized it as a survival tool. "Not anything in our records." "I'm from somewhere else," Alucard said. "Somewhere considerably further away than you're imagining." Ladon absorbed this with the professional equanimity of a man who had learned that the universe was larger and stranger than the Geni had historically been prepared to accept. and that adjusting to that fact faster than your rivals was a meaningful strategic advantage. He opened the intelligence file on the table and turned it to face Weir. 17 hive ships, he said. Current positions, headings, estimated culling schedules. 6 months of collection at significant cost. He looked at Weir. We want a weapons demonstration against a Wraith target of our choosing, with Geni observers present. The room processed this. It was, Sheppard thought, the most efficient opening demand he'd heard in 3 years of Pegasus negotiations. No preamble, no relationship building, no pretense that this was anything other than what it was. The Geni had seen the Wraith afraid and wanted to know if they could bottle it. I'm not a weapon, Alucard said. The tone was conversational. The content was not. I want to establish that clearly before this discussion goes further. I'm not a tool. I'm not an asset. I'm not a strategic resource to be allocated. He looked at Ladon with the specific attention he gave to things he was genuinely evaluating. I'm an interested party who has decided, temporarily and for my own reasons, that your collective problems are more engaging than anything else currently available to me. There's a distinction. The distinction, Ladon said carefully, may be philosophical rather than practical, or if your actions and a weapon's actions produce the same outcome. A hammer and a surgeon both cut, Alucard said. The distinction matters to the thing being cut. He leaned forward slightly. What you're proposing is that I perform for you. Kill something specific in a location of your choosing while your people watch and take notes, so that afterward you can determine whether I'm something you can use. He paused. I find that tedious, almost insultingly so. What would you find less tedious? Ladon asked. He was good. He'd absorbed the refusal and pivoted without visible irritation, which Sheppard filed away as meaningful. Something genuine, Alucard said. Not a demonstration, an actual problem. Something that presents real difficulty for everyone in this room and requires my specific qualities to address. He looked at the intelligence file on the table. 17 hive ships, 6 months of collection. You know where they are and what they're planning. He looked up at Ladon. Which one is the worst? Ladon was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across and turned to the 3rd page of the file. Hive designation we call the Unbroken. Queen known as the eldest. She's the oldest living Wraith commander in Pegasus. Our intelligence suggests she predates the Lantean War. She commands 7 cruisers and a hive ship, and she has been systematically culling the Geni's allied populations for 18 months. Not randomly, strategically. She's been removing our support networks, village by village. He looked at Alucard. Our analysts believe she knows about us, about the Geni specifically. She's not culling for food. She's culling to isolate us. The silence that followed was the kind that formed around information that reorganized the stakes of a conversation. A 10,000-year-old Wraith Queen, Sheppard said slowly, who's running a strategic campaign against a specific human faction. He looked at Weir. That's new. That's not new, Teyla said quietly. That is what the Wraith become when they are not focused on simple survival, when they have the resources and the age to think beyond the next culling. She looked at Ladon. How many villages? 43, Ladon said, in 18 months. Ronan made a sound. It was very quiet, and it communicated a great deal. Alucard had been looking at the file page with the eldest's designation on it, and reading whatever tactical data the Geni had compiled. Ship positions, culling patterns, behavioral analysis. with the focused attention of a man professionally evaluating a problem. He turned the page, turned it back, looked at the culling map, 43 villages marked in the Geni notation system, a pattern that when you saw it clearly was not random at all, but methodical, intelligent, a mind operating across an 18-month campaign with the patience of something that had been doing this for 10,000 years. "She's interesting," Alucard said, quietly, with a quality in his voice that had not been there before. Not excitement, exactly. Something more like the recognition he'd shown Ronan on the pier. The identification of something operating at a level that met his attention without condescension. "She's dangerous," Weir said. "Yes," Alucard agreed. "Both things." He closed the file and looked at Ladon. "I'll find her, not for you. Not as a demonstration. Because something that has been thinking for 10,000 years is considerably more interesting than a culling beam pointed at a pier." He looked at Sheppard. "But I want your people with me." Sheppard blinked. Of all the directions the conversation might have gone, this had not featured prominently in his projections. "Why?" Alucard looked at him with the expression of someone answering a question that should not have required an answer. "Because I've been alone for a very long time," he said. "And the last time I did something genuinely interesting completely alone, there was no one to appreciate it. That," he added, with the return of the surface amusement, "is a waste." Outside the conference room windows, the Wraith cruiser was still there, still watching. Its commander had spent the last 3 hours composing a report to her hive that she had rewritten 11 times, because none of the versions adequately captured what the cruiser's sensors had recorded, what her feeding hand remembered, what the hive mind had felt, ripple through it like a cold current. She was, she had realized, not going to be able to explain it. She was going to have to recommend, in terms that would make her sound compromised to anyone who had not felt it, that no Wraith hive attempt to feed in this region. She was going to have to recommend this because the thing on the pier below, the thing in the red coat that had sent thousands of dead voices back up a culling beam, had looked up at her ship with the patient, in interested expression of something that was not fleeing and was not hiding and was not afraid. Was, in fact, waiting. The Wraith commander had been culling for 30 years. She knew what waiting looked like. She knew the difference between prey that had stopped running and a predator that had decided to let you come to it. She knew which one this was. She began composing her recommendation for withdrawal. Below, in the conference room, Sheppard looked at Alucard and weighed the operational calculus of taking an unkillable ancient vampire to find a 10,000-year-old Wraith Queen in the middle of the Pegasus Galaxy. "Okay," he said, because 3 years in Pegasus had recalibrated his threshold for decisions that reasonable people would not make. "We'll need a puddle jumper." "I'll need," Alucard said, standing, coat settling, had adjusted to the precise angle of a man preparing for something he had decided was going to be worth his time. "Nothing? But I'll ride in your puddle jumper." It sounds absurd, and I find that appealing. The puddle jumper designated J7 left Atlantis at 0600 hours, with a crew complement that no mission briefing in the expedition's history had contained, and no mission briefing in any plausible future would likely contain again. Sheppard flying, McKay in the co-pilot seat, running sensor arrays and stress-eating power bars, Teyla and Ronon in the rear compartment, Ladon Radim and one aide representing the Geni's observational interest, and Alucard sitting cross-legged on the floor of the rear compartment because he had examined the available seating, found it insufficient to his aesthetic requirements, and simply sat down on the deck with his coat spread around him like a red tide, which Ronan had stepped over without comment and McKay had photographed for reasons he described as scientific documentation. The eldest's hive ship was 14 hours away at jumper cruise speed, running dark in a debris field near a system the Geni called the Shattered Reach, a region of dense asteroid clusters and the remnants of what had once been a populated system culled to extinction 300 years ago. The stellar bodies of its dead worlds ground down by centuries of Wraith harvesting operations into a graveyard of rock and silence. Good hiding country. The kind of place a 10,000-year-old Wraith Queen chose for her base of operations, not because she needed to hide, but because she understood the psychological weight of operating from the ruins of what you had consumed. McKay had called it theatrical. Ronan had called it something shorter and considerably less diplomatic. Alucard, when informed of the location, had called it elegant, and meant it. The first 8 hours of the journey passed in a way that the mission report would later describe as uneventful, which was technically accurate and completely failed to capture the specific quality of tension that filled J7's rear compartment during those hours. The particular atmosphere generated by 4 experienced Pegasus operators, 1 Geni commander, and an ancient vampire who spent the first 3 hours apparently asleep, the next 2 reading what appeared to be ancient text on a tablet McKay had lent him with significant reluctance, and the final 3 engaged in a conversation with Teyla that no one else in the compartment had been explicitly invited to join, but that everyone was listening to with complete attention. It had started with Teyla asking, quietly, about the souls. "You said you contained them," she said. "No, the people you've killed, or consumed. They're still present?" "Present is one word," Alucard said, without looking up from the tablet. "Accessible is another. They're not suffering, if that's your concern. They're not imprisoned, exactly." He considered. "They're mine. In the way that memory is yours, you can't give it back, you can't release it. But it belongs to you in a way that nothing external can revoke. Do they speak to you?" He looked up then. "Sometimes, when something happens that they have relevant experience with." A pause. "Mostly they watch. They've seen a great deal collectively. 10,000 years of human history, across multiple conflicts, filtered through the perspectives of everyone who was there." He set the tablet down. "It's occasionally useful. More often it's simply company." Teyla was quiet for a moment. "The Wraith take life," she said. "What they consume, does it continue? Is there anything left of the person after?" Alucard looked at her with the full weight of his attention, and the answer, when it came, was delivered without the layer of performance that wrapped most of his communication. "No," he said. "What the Wraith take doesn't persist. They extract the energy and the rest disperses. There's nothing to preserve because they're not interested in the person, only the power." Something moved in his expression, not quite anger, not quite contempt, something older and more considered than either. "That's the difference between what they do and what I do. I consume everything. They waste most of it." Ronan, and who had been looking at the bulkhead with the expression of a man not listening, said, "How many of your passengers were taken by the Wraith before you got to them?" The question landed in the compartment with the weight of personal history rather than tactical inquiry. Alucard looked at him. "None," he said. "I've never been in this galaxy before today." A pause. "But if your question is whether I understand what the Wraith take from people..." He held Ronan's gaze. "I understand consumption. I understand the specific arrogance of something that feeds without considering the value of what it destroys." The red eyes were very steady. "Yes, I understand that." Ronan looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once and went back to looking at the bulkhead. "Ladon, who had been absorbing this exchange with the expression of a man recalibrating his intelligence assessment in real time, leaned forward. "When we reach the hive, what exactly is your approach?" "I'll go in first," Alucard said. "Alone." "That's not..." Sheppard started from the cockpit. "I'll go in first," Alucard repeated, with the patient emphasis of someone who had already completed the planning process and was now sharing conclusions rather than soliciting input. "The eldest has been told, by now, about what her cruiser encountered at Atlantis. She will have processed the warning pulse. She will have formed a hypothesis about what I am, based on 10,000 years of Wraith knowledge. Which means her hypothesis will be wrong in the specific ways that 10,000 years of operating as the apex predator of a galaxy tends to make you wrong." He looked at Sheppard. "She'll want to meet me. Ancient things with genuine intelligence always want to meet things they haven't encountered before. It's a universal constant. And if she tries to feed on you," McKay said, "we get a repeat of the pier. The hive goes into distress." "The hive goes into distress," Alucard confirmed. "At which point the hive's defensive coherence degrades. The Wraith operate on a collective consciousness that is significantly impaired when the Queen experiences something the hive mind has no category for. Your people use that window." He looked at Sheppard. "That you've done hit and fade operations against Wraith hives before." "More than I'd like," Sheppard said. "Then you know what to do with a 30-second window of degraded hive response." He picked up the tablet again. "I'll make it longer than 30 seconds. The shattered reach materialized on J7's sensors 2 hours later. A sprawling field of dark rock and ancient debris. The asteroid clusters dense enough to eat sensor resolution at range. The kind of terrain that swallowed ships and didn't give them back. Somewhere in its depths, the eldest's hive ship ran dark and waited with the patience of something that had decided waiting was not a cost, but a strategy. McKay found it on the third sensor sweep. Not by its power signature, the eldest was good enough to suppress that, but by the absence in the debris field, on the specific shape of clear space around something large that the asteroids were not occupying. The negative space of a hive ship. 10 kilometers of grown organic architecture hiding in the ruins of what it had helped create 3 centuries ago. "She knows we're here," Teyla said. She said it with the certainty of someone whose people had survived Wraith their entire lives by developing instincts that instruments couldn't replicate. "She let us find her." "Of course she did," Alucard said. He was standing now, which in the low headroom of J7's rear compartment meant he was slightly hunched, which should have diminished the overall impression, and somehow did not. "I told you, she wants to meet me." He looked at Sheppard. "Get me within transporter range." "We don't have transporters," McKay said. Alucard looked at him. "Then get me within jumping distance." He said it as though the clarification was obvious, and the alternative had been a reasonable assumption on his part, which suggested a level of baseline technological expectation that McKay filed away as a data point about wherever Alucard came from. "Jumping distance," McKay repeated. "You can, right? Of course you can." He pulled up the navigation display. "If you can clear the hull without a suit, we can get you to the hive's outer membrane in about 40 seconds at current approach speed." "Done," Alucard said. "I was going to say the outer membrane is covered in Wraith defense nodes." "Done," Alucard said again. With the serenity of a man for whom defense nodes were a category of concern, he had retired from entertaining. Sheppard brought J7 in low along the debris field's inner edge, using the asteroid clusters as cover with the practiced ease of a pilot who had been threading puddle jumpers through impossible terrain for 3 years. The hive ship grew on the forward sensors, enormous, dark, organic, its surface moving with the slow biological activity of a living ship. the defense nodes tracking outward in rotating patterns that Sheppard noted and navigated between, with the geometric precision of a man who did not have room for imprecision. 40 seconds, McKay said. Alucard moved to the rear hatch. He paused with one hand on the release mechanism and looked back at the compartment. Sheppard focused forward, McKay running calculations, Teyla steady, Ronon ready. Ladon watching with the expression of a man witnessing something he would spend the rest of his career trying to adequately describe in reports. If this goes wrong, Alucard said, wait for the hive mind disruption signal before you move in. Don't improvise on my behalf. I don't need rescuing, and attempts to do so will complicate what I'm doing. And if the hive mind disruption doesn't come? Sheppard asked. Alucard smiled. The third smile, the genuine one, the one with the edge. Then something genuinely interesting happened, he said, and you should absolutely come and see. He opened the hatch. In the void between J7 and the eldest's hive ship, in the silence of the shattered reach, where a galaxy's worth of consumed lives had drifted for 3 centuries, Alucard stepped out into space and fell toward the hive, with his coat spreading around him in the vacuum like something that had decided the laws of physics were a useful framework rather than a binding constraint. The hive's defense nodes tracked him. None of them fired. Deep in the hive ship's organic command center, the eldest, 10,000 years old, older than the Lantean War, older than the treaty that had ended it, older than the current shape of the Pegasus Galaxy's sphere, felt something approaching through her ship's outer membrane and opened her eyes. She had been waiting. She had, in all her 10,000 years, never waited for anything with this specific quality of anticipation. The warning pulse had reached her 6 hours ago. She had read it 3 times, which was 2 times more than she had ever needed to read anything. She had dismissed her cruiser commanders from her presence and sat alone in the hive mind's deepest current and thought, with the full force of 10 millennia of accumulated intelligence, about what it meant. Something was coming that fed on life the way the Wraith fed on life. Something that had looked at a culling beam and sent 10,000 dead voices back along it. Something that was, the warning pulse suggested, not afraid of the Wraith. She felt it enter the outer membrane, felt it move through the hive's biological corridors with a certainty of direction that meant it either had detailed knowledge of hive architecture or simply didn't care about getting lost. Felt the workers and warriors it passed recoil without attacking, their instincts overriding their conditioning, something in their deep biology recognizing a register of predator they had no training to respond to. She composed herself. 10,000 years of composure. The full weight of it, deployed. The doors to the command chamber opened. Alucard walked in. Lou looked around at the organic architecture with the tourist appreciation he'd given Atlantis, finding it adequate, finding it interesting in its own way. And then looked at the eldest. The eldest looked back. For a moment, nothing happened. 2 ancient things, in a dead ship, in a graveyard of a system, regarding each other across the space of a command chamber, with the mutual assessment of entities that had both lived long enough to know that first impressions were data and data was everything. "You're older than I expected," Alucard said. "You are not what I expected," the eldest said. Her voice was the voice of Wraith Queens, resonant, layered, carrying the harmonic of the hive mind beneath every word. "I have been alive for 10,000 years. I have fed on 1,000 species. I've never felt what came back up my cruiser's culling beam." "No," Alucard agreed. "You wouldn't have." "What are you?" Alucard smiled. Not the tourist smile. Not the performance. The real one, the one that surfaced when something had earned it. "Something older than you," he said. "Let's talk about that." The eldest had not survived 10,000 years by underestimating things she didn't understand. This was the first and most fundamental principle of her existence, the axiom around which everything else had organized itself across a span of time that had consumed civilizations, ended wars, and watched the ancients themselves abandon physical existence rather than continue a conflict they couldn't win. She had fed on the strong and the clever and the desperate. She had absorbed the strategies of 1,000 dead commanders into the hive mind's collective memory and used them against their successors. She had outlasted every Wraith Queen who had ever challenged her authority by the simple mechanism of being willing to think in timescales that broke lesser minds. She looked at Alucard and thought in the longest timescale she had. The hive mind murmured around her. Her cruisers, her warriors, the 7 ships running dark in the Shattered Reach's debris clusters. The 200 Wraith aboard this hive ship whose consciousness fed into hers in a constant current of shared sensation and collective awareness. She felt them feeling him, felt the unease propagate through the collective like a stone dropped in still water, rippling outward from the warriors nearest the command chamber, through the workers and drones to the cruiser crews holding position outside. Every Wraith in her hive registering the presence in her command center and arriving through their individual instincts and the hive's accumulated knowledge. At the same conclusion, her cruiser commander had reached 6 hours ago. This was not prey. "You carry the dead," the eldest said, and she said it the way a scientist states an observation. Not accusation, not awe. Simple, factual acknowledgement. "I can feel them. Through the hive mind. Thousands of presences contained within you. Aware." She tilted her head, the long, pale features of her face moving through an expression that was not human, but was legible. "We take life. We have never taken the dead. What you do is something else." "What I do," Alucard said, "is considerably more thorough." He had not sat. He stood in the center of the command chamber with his hands behind his back, a posture that might have been respectful in a different context, and in this context communicated simply that he had chosen it, which was its own statement. "You extract energy and discard the rest. I take everything. The memory, the personality, the accumulated experience. Every person I've ever consumed is still present, still contributing." He paused. "You've been wasting your food." The eldest was quiet for a moment. "That is a philosophical position on consumption. It's an operational one. Your hive mind is a collective of living Wraith consciousness. Mine is a collective of everything I've ever ended. You grow yours by breeding. I grow mine by living." He looked at her steadily. "You've had 10,000 years. How many minds does your hive mind contain?" "Thousands," she said. "I contain more," he said simply. "And unlike yours, mine don't die." The hive mind registered something at the edges of the eldest's awareness, not threat, not the specific signal that triggered her warrior's combat response, but a deeper register of wrongness. Yet the biological alarm of something that had evolved over millions of years to identify predators and was now producing an alert it had never needed to produce before. She suppressed it with the discipline of 10 millennia and kept her focus on the figure in front of her. "The humans," she said. "The expedition from the other galaxy. You've chosen to remain with them." "Temporarily," Alucard said. "They're interesting. More interesting than I expected from the briefing materials." "They are prey," the eldest said. Not cruelly, factually, the way one might describe the function of any object in its designed role. "They shot down 3 of your hive ships in the last 2 years," Alucard said. "They destroyed a replicator civilization. They have been operating in your galaxy for 3 years with technology they partially understand against an enemy they cannot match on paper, and they are, by every metric, still here and still fighting. He tilted his head. In my experience, prey doesn't do that. Prey runs. What your expedition has been dealing with is something that has decided not to be prey, which is a fundamentally different category of problem. He paused. I know. I've been in both categories. The eldest processed this. 10,000 years of processing, running at full capacity. You came here, she said, to stop my campaign against the Geni networks. I came here, Alucard said, because you are the most interesting thing in this galaxy, and I wanted to see you in person. The campaign is secondary. He looked at her with the full weight of whatever lived behind the red eyes and the orange glasses and the theatrical coat. The real thing, the accumulation of centuries looking out through a face it had chosen. But yes, the campaign ends. You cannot command me, she said. The hive mind pressed the statement through with the full harmonic weight of 10,000 years of authority. The voice that had directed cullings and broken civilizations and sent fleets across the Pegasus Galaxy on her word alone. Nothing commands me. No, Alucard agreed. But I can offer you something more valuable than the Geni networks. She waited. I can show you what I am, he said. Not the surface, not the reading your cruiser got through the culling beam, the actual depth of it. You know what 10 centuries of genuine consumption produces. What it looks like when something that feeds on life does it completely instead of partially. He held her gaze. You have been the apex predator of this galaxy for 10,000 years. You have never met anything that operated on the same register. I'm telling you that I do. And I'm offering you the opportunity to understand it before deciding whether you want to be on the wrong side of it. The silence in the command chamber was the silence of a mind thinking at geological speed. Outside, in J7 holding position in the debris field, Sheppard watched the hive ship's sensor output with the focused attention of a man waiting for a window that might not open. The hive mind disruption signal hadn't come. The defense nodes hadn't fired. The hive was running dark and still and completely unreadable. And the absence of information was its own kind of information. And what it said was that whatever was happening in that command chamber was not following any script Sheppard had operational experience with. How long do we give him? McKay asked. He said wait for the signal, Ronan said. He also said if something genuinely interesting happened, we should come and see, McKay said. I'm trying to calibrate which category this is. Not yet, Teyla said quietly. She was looking at the hive ship on the sensor display with the specific expression she got when her Wraith sensitivity was producing information that instruments couldn't. Something is happening in there. The hive mind is active, but not in distress. It's more like, she searched for the word, consideration. In the command chamber, the eldest made her decision. She fed. It was not a choice made from hunger. She was not hungry, had fed recently, had the full reserves of a queen who planned carefully and wasted nothing. It was a choice made from the same impulse that had kept her alive for 10,000 years. When you encounter something you don't understand, you reach for it with everything you have and find out what happens. She extended her right hand, the feeding organ engaging with the practiced efficiency of 10 millennia, and pushed it toward Alucard with the full force of a queen's enhanced feeding ability. Not the passive draw of a standard feeding, but an active extraction, the kind she used on other Wraith when she needed to make a point. It connected. And what came back was not life force. What came back was everything. The eldest had fed on 1,000 species. She had taken the life force of humans and aliens, and things that did not have names in any language she spoke. And she had processed all of it through the hive mind and added it to her own vast reserve. She had never, in 10,000 years, fed on something that fed back. The connection opened, and through it poured not energy, but presence. The accumulated weight of every soul Alucard had ever consumed. Suddenly and completely aware of the eldest's feeding organ. Suddenly and completely interested in the mind behind it. Thousands of voices, not speaking, but looking, turning their collective attention toward the Queen of the Wraith with the unified focus of something that had been waiting for exactly this kind of contact and knew exactly what to do with it. They showed her what they were. Not images, not memories. Something more fundamental. The texture of having been fully consumed, of having been taken completely and kept completely, of existing within Alucard's impossible interior as something preserved rather than spent. They showed her the difference between what the Wraith did and what he did. They showed her, with the combined clarity of thousands of perspectives, what it felt like from the inside of each process. The eldest's feeding hand recoiled. The hive mind erupted. Every wraith in the hive ship, every wraith in every cruiser in the shattered reach. I felt the Queen's experience cascade through the collective consciousness with the force of something that had no precedent in the hive's 10,000-year memory. Warriors dropped weapons. Navigators lost course headings. 2 cruiser commanders simultaneously ordered emergency stops that their crews executed with the automatic compliance of beings whose voluntary function had been temporarily overridden by the sheer overwhelming input of a Queen's full cognitive disruption. In J7, every sensor lit up. "That's the signal," Sheppard said, and his hands were already moving on the controls. The eldest stood in her command chamber with her feeding hand withdrawn and pressed against her chest, and the hive mind screaming its disorientation through her, and looked at Alucard with 10,000 years of composure, running at full capacity to keep her upright and present and functional. Alucard had not moved. "The campaign ends," he said again, quietly, with the same tone as before. Not a command, not a threat. A statement of what was going to happen, delivered with the certainty of something that had already seen how the remaining options resolved. The eldest breathed. In the hive mind, the disruption was already settling, her warriors reasserting function, her cruiser crews reorienting. She was a queen, and queens were the anchor of the collective. And she had survived the contact and was still standing, and that meant the hive mind would follow her back to stability. But the memory was in the collective now. The texture of what had come through the connection. The thousands of voices. The depth of genuine consumption, the absolute contrast between what the Wraith took and what was possible. It would not leave. "The campaign ends," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hand was still against her chest. "What do you want in return?" "Nothing," Alucard said. "I told you. I'm not negotiating. I'm informing you of what will happen." He tilted his head. "But I'll offer you something freely. A piece of information that costs me nothing and may be worth everything to you." He paused. "The humans from the other galaxy, the expedition, they've been trying to defeat you for 3 years with weapons and strategy. That's not how they'll eventually succeed." He looked at her steadily. "They'll succeed because they're interesting, because they keep producing individuals worth paying attention to, because whatever they are not finished becoming it yet." He held her gaze. "Neither are you. 10,000 years, and you're still thinking. Still adapting, still here." Something in his expression that was not respect, but was adjacent to it. Don't throw that away on a campaign against a population of humans hiding underground. The eldest looked at him for a long time. Outside, in the shattered reach, 3 puddle jumpers were moving through the debris field. Sheppard had brought J7 to the hive ship's outer membrane and launched the 2 cloaked jumpers from their holding positions, all 3 now running tactical patterns through the cruiser's confusion window, documenting positions, pulling sensor data on the full extent of the Eldest's fleet, with the methodical efficiency of an expedition that had learned to use every available second of Wraith disorientation. The window lasted 4 minutes and 37 seconds. It was enough. When the Eldest's cruisers reoriented and began active sensor sweeps, the jumpers were already gone, back into the debris field, running dark and quiet with more intelligence on the Eldest's fleet than the Geni had collected in 6 months. In the command chamber, Alucard moved toward the door. "Now you're leaving," the Eldest said. "I have what I came for," he said. "So do you." He paused at the door. "One more thing. The cruiser you sent to Atlantis, recall it. Not because I'm asking, because leaving it there is a waste of a perfectly good cruiser, and you don't strike me as someone who wastes things." He walked out. The Eldest stood in her command chamber for a long time after he left, in the hive mind's slowly settling current, surrounded by the memory of 10,000 voices looking back at her through a feeding connection she had initiated and immediately regretted and would spend a very long time processing. She recalled the cruiser. J7 made the return journey to Atlantis in a silence that was different in quality from the silence of the outbound trip. Denser, more considered. The specific quiet of people who had witnessed something they were still in the process of understanding and had collectively decided that speaking about it before that process completed would produce inadequate language. McKay had attempted analysis twice and stopped himself both times, which was so unprecedented that Ronan had looked at him on the second occasion with an expression of mild concern. Teyla sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance, processing whatever the hive mind's eruption had felt like from the outside of it. She hadn't described it yet, and no one had asked. You giving her the space that 3 years of working together had taught them she sometimes needed. Ladon Radim was composing something on his data tablet with the focused intensity of a man who understood that what he had witnessed was going to require careful translation for an audience that had not been present. Alucard sat on the floor of the rear compartment and looked at the ceiling of J7 with the expression of a man who had eaten a good meal and was taking appropriate time to appreciate it. Sheppard flew. It was Ronan who spoke first, which surprised no one who understood that Ronan's apparent silence was rarely the absence of thought, and more often the presence of thought, operating at a depth that took time to surface. "The villages, she called," he said. 43 of them. She's not going to undo that." "No," Alucard said, without looking away from the ceiling. "She's not. So she stops now, after 43? "Yes." Ronan was quiet. "Is that enough?" Alucard lowered his eyes from the ceiling and looked at Ronan with the full attention he reserved for questions that deserved it. "No," he said. "It's not enough. It will never be enough. 43 villages is 43 villages, and nothing that happens afterward makes that a different number." He held Ronan's gaze. "But the 44th doesn't happen, and the 45th, and every village that would have followed." He paused. "I don't deal in justice. I deal in what stops and what continues. They're not the same thing, and pretending they are helps no one." Ronan absorbed this with the expression of a man recognizing a truth he already knew from his own history, and finding it no easier in the recognition. "Could you have stopped her earlier?" he asked. "If you'd gone straight to her, instead of Atlantis?" "Yes," Alucard said. The answer sat in the compartment with all its implications fully visible, and no attempt to soften them. "Then why didn't you?" Ronan said. It was not quite a question and not quite an accusation. It was the voice of 7 years of running, of watching worlds get culled, finding its way into language. Because I didn't know she existed until 6 hours into my stay here, Alucard said. And because I arrived through a rift that your scientist created by accident at 4 in the morning, not through any plan of my own. He looked at Ronan steadily. I am not a solution that was late to arrive. I'm a coincidence that turned useful. There's a difference. Don't build mythology around it. This was, Sheppard thought from the cockpit, the most honest thing Alucard had said since he arrived. Stripped entirely of the performance and the layered amusement and the deliberate theater of his presentation, and it landed with the weight of honesty delivered without cushioning, which was both harder and more useful than the cushioned kind. Atlantis materialized on the forward sensors 2 hours later. The city's towers rising from the ocean in the early light of the Pegasus system star, the shield still up, the sensor arrays still running their continuous vigil. The whole vast ancient edifice of it, sitting on the water with the patient permanence of something built to last longer than the civilizations it was meant to protect. On approach, McKay confirmed what the long-range sensors had already suggested. The Wraith cruiser that had spent the day in the upper atmosphere was gone. Recalled, as Alucard had predicted, with the quiet efficiency of a queen making a decision and implementing it without ceremony. The city looked, from the air, exactly as it had when they left. It was not the same city. Weir met them in the jumper bay with the expression of someone who had spent the last 14 hours managing the operational and diplomatic fallout of an entity she did not fully understand, doing something she could not fully predict, and who had done it competently, because competence was what she brought to situations that exceeded her briefing materials. She looked at Sheppard first, which was habit, and then at Alucard, which was necessity. The Wraith cruiser left, she said. I know, Alucard said. Ladon's intelligence on the eldest's fleet position. McKay tells me what you collected during the disruption window is more detailed than anything we've had on her previously. That was the point, Sheppard said. We used the window. It worked. Weir absorbed this, filed it, moved forward. The Geni are going to want a formal debrief. There are going to be questions about what happened in that command chamber that I'm not going to be able to fully answer. Tell them the campaign against their networks has ended, Alucard said, moving past her toward the jumper bay exit, with the purposeful ease of someone who had completed a task and was already thinking about what came next. Tell them the eldest received a communication that changed her strategic calculus. The details are operationally sensitive. He paused. They'll be annoyed. They'll accept it. Pragmatists always accept results they can verify over explanations they can't. Weir watched him go, and then looked at Sheppard with the specific expression she reserved for situations that had resolved in ways she hadn't predicted and wasn't sure she should be relieved about. He's right, Sheppard said. About the Geni. I know, Weir said. That's not what I'm thinking about. What she was thinking about? What all of them were thinking about? In various formulations shaped by their individual experiences of the last 24 hours, was the question of what came next. Not tactically, not diplomatically. The larger question, the one that the ancient monitoring system had been circling since 0347 hours the previous morning, with its blinking amber indicator and its notations about unresolvable entities and genuinely uncertain outcomes. Alucard was still here. The Wraith knew he was here. The Geni knew he was here. The eldest knew he was here and had made a significant strategic decision on the basis of that knowledge. The Pegasus Galaxy had, in the space of 24 hours, developed an awareness of something new in its operational landscape. Something that did not fit its established categories, us That had walked into a 10,000-year-old Wraith Queen's command chamber and walked out again. That had sent thousands of dead voices back up a culling beam and produced the first Wraith emergency threat classification in 60 years. The galaxy had noticed. And in the city's deepest monitoring systems, where ancient algorithms ran their patient vigil, a new entry had been made in the classification file for the entity designated as unresolvable. It was not a reclassification. It was an addendum, added with the careful precision of a system that had processed 10,000 years of data and understood the value of accurate record-keeping. It read, "Entity has engaged with primary threat structure of Pegasus Galaxy. Outcome, threat structure modified. Mechanism, unknown. Arc assessment. This unit does not have adequate framework to classify what occurred. Recommendation, continued observation. Secondary recommendation, do not attempt to classify." Some things are more usefully understood as conditions than as categories. The system paused. Then it added one final line, in the smallest notation available, in the careful ancient script of something that had been processing data for 10 millennia and had learned, in that time, the difference between information and wisdom. This unit notes that the Pegasus Galaxy is no longer the same galaxy it was 24 hours ago. This unit notes further that the entity responsible for this change is currently in the East Tower, apparently reading ancient historical records and occasionally making dismissive sounds at the parts it finds intellectually unimpressive. This unit finds this, on reflection, appropriate. In the East Tower, Alucard sat in a chair that was 10,000 years old and read about a civilization that had built a city on the ocean and fought a war they couldn't win and eventually left. And he thought about what it meant to be ancient in a universe that kept producing new things. And he thought about 43 villages and the number that came after 43. And he thought about a Satadan who had survived 7 years of being hunted and still shot first. And a pilot who treated impossible situations with the conversational register of a man discussing weekend plans. And a woman from a planet that had lived in terror of the Wraith since before she was born, who had asked about the souls with the specific quality of someone for whom the answer genuinely mattered. He thought about the eldest, standing in her command chamber with 10,000 years of composure, holding her upright, asking, "What do you want in return?" with the voice of something that had never needed to ask that question before and had asked it anyway. He thought about what the ancient system had noted without being able to name. That something had changed. That the galaxy was different. That conditions were not the same as they had been at 0347 hours when a rift opened in a research lab and something stepped through because it was bored. He was not bored now. He turned a page. Outside the East Tower windows, the Pegasus system star was setting over the ocean, turning the water the color of old fire, and the city hummed around him with the patient intelligence of 10,000 years of accumulated purpose. And in the deep dark of the galaxy, in hive ships and human settlements and the spaces between stars, something new was present in the operational landscape. Not a weapon, not an ally, not an enemy, not anything that fit the established categories that the Pegasus Galaxy had been using to understand itself for 10 millennia. A condition, an unresolvable entity. Something ancient and interested, sitting in a chair by a window in a city on the ocean, reading history and finding most of it slightly unimpressive, and occasionally finding, in the gaps between the recorded events, something that made him pause and read the passage again. Something that was, for reasons entirely its own, still here. The Pegasus Galaxy had been defined for 10,000 years by a single, brutal equation. The Wraith fed, humanity endured, and the cycle continued with the grinding inevitability of a mechanism too large and too established to be stopped by anything short of a miracle. The Atlantis expedition had spent 3 years attempting to be that miracle through ingenuity and stubbornness, and the refusal to accept that the equation was fixed. They had bent it. They had not broken it. Alucard had walked through a rift in reality at 4 a.m, drunk a man's coffee without permission, survived 5 shots from a particle magnum, sent 10,000 dead voices back up a Wraith culling beam, and told a 10,000-year-old queen to stop what she was doing. Not with force, not with negotiation, but with the simple, the overwhelming weight of something so far outside the established categories that the categories themselves became inadequate. The eldest's campaign was over. The Wraith emergency classification remained in the galactic record. 43 villages would not become 44. And in the East Tower of Atlantis, something ancient and amused and genuinely, unexpectedly engaged read ancient history by the light of a setting sun and made dismissive sounds at the parts it found unimpressive, and was, for the first time in longer than it cared to calculate, something other than bored. The Pegasus Galaxy would not be the same. Whether that was salvation or simply a different kind of complicated, only time, and something with a great deal of it, would tell.